going to give her second keynote, which is Encounter, Accompany, Community, and Sin. So let's welcome Dr. Timoney.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Can everyone hear okay? Mic sound? Perfect. Super. Okay. I think we should take a moment to remind ourselves that we're always and everywhere in the presence of God, and so we begin in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
And on this Feast of the Archangels, Lord, we give you thanks for all the ways you manifest your grace in our world, and in our minds, and in our hearts. And so we ask you that in the course of these days, we can be ever more ready to respond to the call to be missionary disciples, to respond to the call to be able to announce the good news to those we meet. And this we ask in our Lord's name. Amen.
Amen.
For those of you who may not have been able to be with us last night, I just want to give a short summary to lead us into today. So our overall theme is talking about that by virtue of our baptism, we have been called to be missionary disciples. So with our bishop, with our priest, with our religious sisters, and the laity together, all have this vocation and mission to go out and to point others toward Christ. To go out and to be able to say, we have found something in coming to know the living Lord, and we want you to come and to see. We know that they're the very words, right, that Jesus' first invitations to the disciples were, come and see. And we know that the beautiful experience when they did come and see was that they remained with the Lord. So last night we were talking about what does it mean to point others toward Christ? How is it that we do that in a particularly Catholic context, in the Catholic way of evangelization? Because the great gift we've been given as Catholics is we know that people come to encounter Christ most deeply and most fully in and through the sacramental life of the church. And so when we invite people to come and see, we're necessarily inviting them into the lives of our communities, in our parishes, and in the local church. And that's where I want to pick up today, because in Pope Francis's continuing this conversation about how we're called to evangelize in the modern world, and I always have to remember I teach freshmen. That's one of the reasons I moved from back there to up here, because with freshmen you got to be closer to people, you got to see what's going on behind those laptops that they bring to class. I always have to remind them when we're reading the documents of the Second Vatican Council, and the Council Fathers were talking about the modern world, and I have to take a deep breath and say, now in 1960s they were talking about affordable airfare travel and TVs in every household. And of course these are kids that don't even watch TV anymore, right? But Pope Francis so has continued this conversation that we've been about as a church for the last 40 years. One is, how is the church going to continue to be present in the modern world, inviting people to come to know Christ? And a big part of that was the renewal, particularly of the vocation and mission of lay people to be actively engaged in the mission of the church. That it's not for ours simply to receive the gift the church has to offer, but it's for ours to be co-workers, co-collaborators, co-responsible for the life of the church. So today we're going to focus on the parish. We're going to focus on this idea of accompanying, both within the context of the parish and the parish moving out beyond the boundaries of the property, so to speak, into the community. I love this topic because I love parish life. For most of my 30 years of ministry, it has been in parish life or in diocesan leadership working with parishes. Currently, I'm the president of our Parish Pastoral Council at my own parish. And you know, I think one of the first times I remembered the gift that parish can be was after my first week in Alaska when I arrived in town as a Jesuit volunteer. So we were met at the airport on three-wheelers and we were driven to our home. And of course, I wanted to be a Jesuit volunteer because I was going to be poor and love Jesus. Now, as growing up in suburban Philadelphia, of course, I had no idea what it meant to be poor. So we arrived at the first door of our house, which was a trailer. And it was like, oh wow. I never imagined living in a trailer, but here I am. And then the first thing we were shown was how we use the dry toilet. And at what point you have to take the toilet across town to the water station to empty it. And then we were welcomed that night by someone who brought us fresh moose meat. And it was bloody and it had hair. And I thought, holy cow, there's a lot that goes on between killing something and going to the grocery store and picking up this beautifully wrapped piece of meat in plastic. And I thought, I'll never survive. I will just never survive. And I got to Mass and I sat down in the church and I thought, okay, this is familiar. And the priest came out and he had a really thick Boston accent, and I had gone to college in New England, and it was like, okay, this is good. I know where I am. But it also taught me, right, it's always home. Because what was beautiful was Mass in Tanana, with the residents of Tanana, was in fact very much the same and also completely different. But there was the Lord that I encountered every time I walked into a parish. 2 years ago, I was in Australia at their diocese in Sydney, at their evangelization conference. They do one every 2 years for the whole country. And following that, I went on to Melbourne to do some work in parishes on parish pastoral councils. And I remember sitting in the church basement and looking around and thinking, I flew halfway across the world to come to a church basement that looks like every other church basement that I've ever presented in. And again, it made it feel like home. Because when those of us who are active in our parishes know what it means to walk into the parish, to the church basement, there's a way in which we feel at home. And that is deeper sometimes than I think we appreciate. Because my other experience at the Archdiocese was being the coordinator if we needed to do some crisis intervention at our parishes. And inevitably, if you're doing some crisis intervention, it's some pretty dark days at the parish. And in some ways, I was seeing the parish sometimes at its worst. And yet, inevitably, parishioners would say to me, Susan, please come back when we get through this, because this is a great parish, and there are great people here. And I think that's so true, right? Because when we're actively engaged in our parish, it becomes family. And so we know that there's going to be tough times and dark times, but we also know that there's a grace there that makes us want to stay rather than go. And so we have a lot to offer people by this way of community. But Pope Francis is challenging us to think about the way we practice community with a different kind of intentionality. He draws his inspiration from Pope Paul VI, who said this: a parish is not principally a structure, a territory, or a building, but rather the family of God, alive in fellowship with a unifying spirit. And so what we want to have in our minds is this idea of how do we make sure what people experience when they come into our community is this unifying spirit. So Pope Francis, I think, has added some really significant ideas to the teaching about the role of the parish in the life of the person. He's saying more about parishes, I think, that have been said since the 1980s. And it gets to the heart of his cry, right, his insistence that we need to go out and meet people and invite them to come and see. In a way, right, he's kicking it retro, as the teens like to say, and going back to the way that Jesus did it as our model. Jesus, as you might recall, did not build a church. He did not pick one town to stay in and say, okay, bring everybody to me, and I'm going to preach and I'm going to teach, and this will be the center of my ministry. Jesus, in fact, was always on the move. He was in the marketplace, he was on the lake with the fishermen, he was in people's homes. But for us, we know that we've been given the gift of the base of our parish because, in fact, Jesus lives here in the Eucharist. And so we know, though, we want the parish to be the base from which we go out. How do we end every Mass, right? Go and share the good news. Go and live the life of the gospel. So we're never meant, in a sense, to stay and to wait until people come. This idea of this new pattern, this new rhythm of evangelization, is nicely captured in this pamphlet called Living as Missionary Disciples. And it was the U.S. Bishop's vision for the implementation of Pope Francis's exhortation, The Joy of the Gospel. And so I didn't have a handout this morning because I want you to go online and to download this document. I think it's one of the best things the bishops have written in the last 20 years. It's short, that's always a good sign, right? It's really easy to read and it's really practical. And what it does is, it says, there are 4 rhythms to living the joy of the gospel and sharing the gospel that ought to be part of the rhythm of our parish life. And that it's for each individual community to be able to break open their rhythm as it meets the needs of their community. And so as I was introduced this morning, the rhythm is that we encounter Christ, we accompany people, we build community, and we send people out. So last night, I'm sort of working backwards, right? We talked a lot about sending. And this morning, I want to talk about accompanying, because I think this is the most impactful part of Francis's teaching when it comes to parish ministry. We've talked a lot over the last 20 years or so in the United States about moving our parishes from maintenance to mission. And we have lots of big programs out there that are helping us think, how do we do that? And the idea, I think, is we're in a maintenance mode, not because we don't have new things to share or good news, but because we're working really hard to keep all of the great things we have going on going. And we know inevitably there's that statistic that 20% of the people do 100% of the work, right? So we know we've got a lot of folks who are part of a parish, but not actively engaged. And so the maintenance isn't bad in the sense of a lot of our parishes are doing really great ministry. But what Pope Francis wants us to say is it the right ministry at the right time to meet the needs of the people? This is what he's asking us. The bishops, in following up this call of Pope Francis, have been asking us to say, okay, let's boldly rethink what it might be like to be able to accompany people in a closer way. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what I mean by that. I think sometimes we take for granted that we know what people mean, know what it means to be Catholic. Or that sometimes we think that we don't have the ability to be able to do the work that we're being called to do. But here's what Pope Francis says about the parish and the mission of the parish. He asks us to think about if we really are meeting the needs of the community by thinking about the way in which our parish reflects the face of the community. Now here's a test that I want to give you. Do the people sitting in your pew look like the people in the grocery store? Because I think the grocery store is the one place in the community that everybody needs to go. And so if you're in the grocery store closest to your parish, and you take a look around, do the people in the aisle of the grocery store look like the people in the aisle for communion on a Sunday? Just take a minute to talk amongst yourselves about that. Would you say that the folks in the grocery store reflect the face of the folks in the pew on Sunday? And if not, who's missing? Who's in the grocery store that you don't see in church? Okay, so take some time to talk about that. Okay, just by a show of hands, who were some of the people that were identified, maybe not in parish in the same numbers that you see them in the grocery store? Just call out some.
Teenagers.
Teenagers. Mm-hmm.
Your family.
Your family. Okay, yep. Yep. Moms and babies.
Yeah.
Alaskan natives. Mm-hmm. So I think that this is a pretty good test as a way to get us thinking about who might be being asked to reach out and what would it mean to accompany those folks, to welcome them into the community life of the parish. Pope John the 23rd had this great image of a parish. He said that the parish ought to be the hub of community life, like the village fountain. Well, he was from a small town in Italy, and if you've ever traveled through Italy, you know that every square has a fountain. And before the days of running water, people went there, right, to get their water for drinking, for cooking. And even today, Italians still love getting water from the village fountain. But it's also the place that they exchange greetings, it's the place that they share the gossip of the day. And I think that a lot of small communities have this kind of place where people gather. And so, in John the 23rd's mind, he wanted the parish to fulfill that place in the community. Now, when I talk about accompaniment, we're going to have a chance at the end of the presentation to be able to share from our own experiences, because I think we have a wealth here of villages and small towns and mid-sized cities and larger cities. So my experience most recently, right, has been urban and suburban. And so I want to lay out some principles about accompaniment, about what it means for the parish to be like the village fountain, and then ask you to be able to make the adaptation that best fits your situation. Because for those of you from smaller places, you might see, for the most part, everybody every day. But then Pope Francis adds a second layer to this. He's not going to let us get away with the fact that we live in a place small enough that we really are embedded in the life of the community because of the size of the community. He says this, Pope Francis says, the parish is the church, placed in the neighborhood of humanity, and it lives and is at work in being deeply inserted in human society and intimately bound up with its aspirations and dramatic events. Now that's a very poetic way of preaching about it, but what he means here, right, it's not enough for the parish to be in the community and hopefully there inviting people to the community. But the parish needs to be aware of what the aspirations, what the dreams, what the hopes, what the challenges are of the local community, and be ready to respond and to walk with and accompany people. You know, one thing about the Catholic Church, it's always chosen to be in the world. Not of the world, but in the world. And it's always chosen to want to have, in a sense, a voice at the table. It's one of our greatest strengths. It's why we have schools and hospitals and social agencies and Vincent de Paul societies, because we believe that the love we have for Jesus compels us to help build a better world, to help contribute to the common good, whether the people we're serving are Catholics or Christians or other faiths or believers or non-believers. We want to be a part of building strong communities. And so we want to be involved in people, in the aspirations and in the dramatic events of the community. And so a second question we have to ask ourselves is, how deeply placed is our parish in the life of the community? Are we a part of where there's work that needs to be done, there's love that needs to be shared? Is the parish in the middle of what's going on in the community? Is the parish present to people who are at the peripheries? Is the parish present to those places where people feel most alone or are struggling or feel like they're not even noticed within the community? These are some of the questions Pope Francis is asking us to ask ourselves. I think the biggest task of this new evangelization for parish leaders is that we be places that accompany, that we meet people where they're at and that we love them, and that we invite them to share our experiences. But we're patient in allowing them to respond. Pope Francis often observes, it's often better to simply slow down, to put aside our eagerness to get people into programs, to sign up for religious ed, and to sit with them and just to be. And this, I think, is a huge challenge. It certainly is for me, and I think for any of us who have parish ministries. We're so concerned about getting people in and staying on time and making sure they have everything we need that we often miss a lot of conversations that could happen in the moment. I think I've heard from some of you the inevitable struggle, I think in all of our parishes, of the parents who drop their kids off for religious education, but they're not coming to Sunday Mass. And they're not participating as a family in the life of the parish. Accompany means sitting down and talking to them and saying, how can I help you get to Sunday Mass? How can I help you be active in your kids' education so that it sinks in all the more deeply and fully? And so I think I first want to say something to our parish leaders and our catechists and our choir directors, our Knights of Columbus, the Sodality members. How well are we taking the time simply to be with people? How well are we taking the time to linger and to talk with people? When I was working at the Archdiocese, one of my jobs was sometimes to respond to letters that were written to the Cardinal, because he liked to make, as much as he could, a personal response to every letter. And one woman wrote a letter, and the Cardinal had said something on TV, and she was furious. So she wrote this letter about how angry she was, and she ended the letter by saying, give me one good reason to stay in the church. And she left her phone number. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to call her. If she left her phone number, I'm going to call. And so I called. And she was shocked and super nervous. And I said, well, you sent this letter. And I said, the Cardinal can't respond, but this was a serious question you asked. And so I want to help you answer it. So I agreed to meet her for coffee. And driving over, she lived in the Midwest, had recently moved to Washington to work for a national organization. And she had a terrible experience with a Catholic institution in the Midwest, which prompted a whole kind of series of complaints. And so going over, I had in my mind, okay, she seems to be a little older than I am, and so it's probably going to be women's ordination and humanity. Like, I had the whole list of things that I thought I was going to need to talk about with her. And we went in, and I said, just tell me a little bit about your time here in Washington, because you're relatively new. And so she said, well, the first thing I need to tell you is I'm not going to church anymore. And I said, from your letter, I can understand why that might be. So we talked a little bit about that. And then at a certain point, she said, I just want to say something to you. I actually believe what the church teaches. She's like, I'm not interested in women priests. She said, I'm very pro-life. And I was like, okay. And so she went on to talk about how much she loved the faith. I was like, I think I've lost sight of what the heart of the matter is here, right, that we're going to talk about. And she said, so when I first moved here, I stopped going to church. She said, and then things at work here got really tough. And I asked a coworker what she was doing to help survive the days at work. And she said, I love my parish, and you need to get back to church, and you need to come to my parish. And so she kind of filed that away. But about a month later, a good friend of hers was diagnosed with a terminal illness. And it was Sunday morning, and she thought, I've got nowhere to turn. I'm going to check out that parish. So she went to the parish. She loved being back at the liturgy. She thought the choir was magnificent. And the next day, she signed up to join the choir. So she joined the choir. It's that person who said, when you're ready, you come to my church. But then she kind of drifted away. And she said, I don't know why to stay, and I don't know why to go. And I said, here's the thing. You don't leave the church because you're angry at one person or you're angry at a situation. I said, I want to encourage you to read the creed. And if you're going to leave the church, leave because you don't believe that Jesus is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Or leave because you don't think that Jesus is present in the Eucharist. That's what we celebrate when we come together on Sunday. And she looked at me and she burst into tears and she said, that's exactly it. I don't know if I believe in God. And I thought to myself, the letter that she wrote had nothing to do with what was most on her heart, that she doubted she believed in God. But it took the time and it took the conversation to be able to get to that point to really get at the heart of the matter. It's this kind of thing that Pope Francis is saying, let us make time for that. In some ways, I think what he's saying is maybe less is more when it comes to parish ministry. Maybe it's having more time to be and to accompany people than having X number of programs for people. How do we balance that? That's the question that we're being asked. Now, Pope Francis is totally optimistic about the possibility for parishes to be able to do this. I like to think of myself as a pretty optimistic person. Usually always the glass is half full. But Pope Francis has me beat on this when he says this. The parish is not an outdated institution, precisely because it possesses great flexibility. It can assume quite different contours, depending on the openness and the missionary creativity of the pastor and the community. While certainly not the only institution which evangelizes, if the parish proves capable of self-renewal and constant adaptivity, it continues to be the church living in the midst of the homes of its sons and daughters. Flexibility, constant adaptivity. I will tell you, in my time as parishes, I would not say that flexibility is something that we see in many parishes. Some people sit in the same spot every Sunday for 40 years at the parish. Have you ever been on the parish council when it came time to suggest changing the schedule for masses? Flexibility? I think not. In my parish, the associate pastor decided he was going to get new furniture for the sanctuary. He didn't consult the liturgy committee. He didn't ask the parish council. So one day we walked in and there was new furniture in the sanctuary, and you would have thought he installed theater-style seating. People were furious at new furniture in the sanctuary. So flexibility is kind of crazy talk, I think, when it comes to parishes. But this is exactly what we know can happen, because if we look over the lifespan of our parishes, we absolutely can point to times when we had to change. In the 20 years that I've been a parishioner at my parish, when I first started, we barely had a religious education program for kids because there were so few young families who lived on Capitol Hill. In that 20-year time period now, we have 250 kids in the religious ed program. And so we had to adapt and change, right? And leave go of some things in order to make room for others. I love that what Pope Francis is describing is he wants us to be a parish that really is living in the midst of the homes of her sons and daughters, bound up in the life of the community. And so I want to talk a little bit about what do we mean by accompany. And first I want to talk about it from a theological perspective, because I think for some people, when they hear that we're being asked to accompany people, that they get concerned that it means that we're going to walk with people and kind of this attitude of, I'm okay, you're okay, and if we're going to welcome you, we're welcoming everything that we know about you. And it's true in the sense of we always want to welcome people, we always want to respect the dignity of the human person, but like Jesus, when we talk about accompaniment from the Christian perspective, we're talking about leading them to an encounter with Jesus and calling them to a deeper conversion in their spiritual life. And so we're accompanying people to move toward the beauty of the truth of the gospel and the church's teaching. And that we're doing it in a way that we invite and we walk with and we allow the work of the Holy Spirit through the word, through the sacraments, through the ministry of the church to be able to help that person come to know Jesus more fully. So it's an accompaniment toward a deeper life in Christ. It's an accompaniment that asks the person to consider being ready to fully and actively participate in the sacramental life of the church. And so I think first we say accompanying begins at home. That is to say, we need to be present to one another in the parish, to spend more time in conversation, to spend more time making sure we're forming and nurturing people for ministry and not just doing ministry. If there's one thing that I think about in all the work that I've done with pastoral councils, is that pastoral council is supposed to be an experience of discernment, and we tend to say, we got a full agenda tonight, we're going to say a quick Our Father, and then get to the work of the agenda, right? What we need to say is, if this is the work of discernment, we need to spend a lot of time in prayer, taking these things to the Lord, and then asking the Lord to help us see the way toward the solution. So one of the best talks I was asked to give was at a very large parish that had a tremendous social outreach. But they asked me if I would come and spend a day working with them answering this question: what makes our social outreach look different from the Red Cross? And I thought that that was a really good question, right? Because the church is involved in a lot of charitable works, certainly to help people, but mostly that in the way we do them, people see the face of Christ. And that's not the mission of the great work that the Red Cross does. But it is a good question. Are we revealing who we are as Christians and who we are as followers of Christ in the ministries that we're doing on behalf of our communities? And so one thing I think that Pope Francis is asking us is that he's asking us to say, are we taking the time to be people of prayer and people being formed as disciples so that we know that when we go out and share what we have, people see in us the face of Christ? In an earlier conversation that I had, one person was saying they're rethinking what hospitality means. What does hospitality mean in practice of the community? What does hospitality mean in the life of the culture in which the parish serves? And so sometimes it's pretty easy questions. I know we struggle with offering coffee and donuts every week and inviting everyone to come down, and people come down and you talk to only the people you know. And so the new people who have come down because they've been invited to coffee and donuts kind of stand at the back, right? And around the edges. And no one's talking to them. Is that an experience of hospitality? So it's that intentionality, right? So what does it look like to be accompanying as we move beyond the parish and out into the community? I love seeing the bus parked at the cathedral here in Juneau that goes to the docks to pick people up on Sunday to bring them to Mass. That's a great example of accompaniment, of meeting people where they're at and inviting them to come to Mass and to experience the community. And after walking up the hill, I can say that the bus is a really good idea, because I'm not sure I would have done that trek had I known it. But it begins to go back to the idea of the supermarket, to ask ourselves, who are the people that we think might feel least welcomed by the church and by our parishes? And how do we go out and encounter them and show them that we're interested in them and in their stories and in helping them to be part of the community? And it really takes, I think in some ways, being creative, but also to say that what we're simply trying to do is make our community better known in the larger community. My sister lives in Sweden, in Stockholm, and Sweden is arguably one of the most post-Christian cultures right now, certainly in Europe. And she read the story of a Methodist minister who got to think, what is it that people are doing on Sunday, and where are people on Sunday when they're not at church? And she was driving around one Sunday morning, and she said the parking lot that was most full was the IKEA parking lot. And she realized that her parish was about 5 miles from IKEA. And the other thing she got to notice was lots and lots of Swedes were interested in pilgrimage. And walking the pilgrimage to Santiago, the Camino, was extremely popular. And she said, you know what, I'm going to combine this interest in pilgrimage in the IKEA parking lot, and I'm going to go to IKEA on Sunday mornings and invite people to walk with me to the church, to pray morning prayer, to have coffee, and we'll have a bus that will drive them back to IKEA. It was hugely successful for this parish community. And I thought, how creative was that, right? Rather than bemoaning the fact that people are at IKEA and not at church, I thought, you know what? I'm going to combine these two things and invite them to come back and to remember what it's like to make prayer a part of your Sunday morning pilgrimage. Do any of you here bless animals on the Feast of St. Francis? Yeah, this has become hugely popular. We even have a lot of Protestant churches who are now doing it. But inviting people to bring their animals to be blessed on the feast. I mean, a taste of a tradition in the church that people can feel completely comfortable, right? They're not even going inside the church, right? It's usually outside. But to bring your pet to be blessed. This morning, my parish is at the big Capitol Hill Open Fair Festival to invite people to learn more about the school, but also just to leave a prayer intention. And we were talking about this at Parish Council, and I'll have to say, people were really nervous because, as you know, the church in Washington right now is in a terrible crisis. And you could see on their faces that the idea of being at the festival at a booth for St. Peter's, and one woman even said, "Susan, what can we possibly say?" And I said, I think what we can do is first talk to them about the school, especially if they're young families. I said, I think we can talk to them about the beauty of the church, and the church is always open, and you can stop in and sit and pray or just admire the quiet and the peacefulness. I think we can say to them, what do you need us to pray for? And we're going to pray for you. And they were going to take the intention book so that people could write their prayers down, so that we had something to offer in hopes of starting the conversation. But we're there because that's where the community is going to be gathered, and that's where we ought to be, to say we're part of this community, and we want you to be part of us. So the question is, what can we do most easily to be at the place where the community is gathering, and what can we bring to those gatherings that says something about who we are, but also gives people a taste of what they can find? The other thing that Pope Francis talks a lot about is the peripheries. And when he means the peripheries, I think a lot of times we think he means those who are most poor, those who are most alone, those who are, in a sense, the modern-day outcasts. And I think that that's right. But what I like about the supermarket analogy is sometimes the peripheries are the people who we may not think about, who are sort of in the middle. They might not be living at the edges, right, of our society, but they might be lost in terms of the life of the community. And so I think of what we call the sandwich generation, right? The parents who are raising kids and caring for elderly parents. How are we supporting them and accompanying them? Our single families, our young adults present, and how can we reach out and accompany them? A former colleague of mine has the great privilege of being invited to the Synod on Young People, which begins this week in Rome, to present on behalf of the American Church. And he's going to talk about spiritual mentorship. And he's going to talk about the fact that what young adults want most are mentors. For so many of them, they come from families in which the faith wasn't practiced robustly, or in some cases that their parents aren't practicing the Catholic faith. And they're looking for mentors, and they're looking for guides. And he said, the other thing, we need programs, right? We need to form mentors, but he said they want to be known by name. And for so many of them, when they come to the parish, they can't find their way into the life of the community. And so they don't even feel like maybe the pastor or the leaders in the parish could call them by name. And so there's an example of the peripheries in the context of an urban community with lots of young urban professionals living alone for the first time, living away from family. But I would also challenge you to think about who are at the peripheries of the parish community that maybe aren't the more obvious ones we're aware of and working with and talking to. Because Accompany really focuses on the idea that we're first there to bring God's love to the person and to the place, and if the time is right, to encounter it more fully. We want to be there to say to people, we want to walk with you for as long as it takes. And the RCIA program is the most ancient form of accompaniment in the church. From the very beginning of the church, the way in which we brought catechumens into the life of the community, and we still do today, is absolutely what we mean by accompaniment. Inviting them to come and ask questions about the faith, and at a certain point asking them to become students of the faith, and then asking them to go through a series of scrutinies, right, to say, I'm ready to enter into this process of conversion, and then to bring them into the life of the church. Now, in the early days of the catechumenate, the church at the time only celebrated the sacrament of reconciliation once. And so some people remained catechumens for 30 and 40 years because they weren't going to go to confession until they were close to death, right? Thankfully, as a church, we saw the value, right, of confession regularly and often. But I think in some ways we've almost turned our RCIA process into a program. If you start in September, and if you come to the right of election, then you'll come into the church at Easter. Oh, and if you get your marriage regularized, then you can come into the church at Easter. And we've lost the sight that we need to give people time and space. And so maybe it's far better if they say, this isn't the time for me to come into the church. Do you know that the rate of dropout a year after someone comes into the church is 50%? 50% of the people who came in at Easter are not regularly going to church the following Easter. And so here's a great example of the church that needs to renew. We've got the process. It's been with us from the very beginning of the establishment of the church. And we need to just step back and say, how can we tweak it in a sense in this new age? But how can we return to this slow process of leading and guiding people toward Christ at their own pace, let's say. The good thing about Accompany is that there's not a high bar for success. That we're just asking people to show up and to be there for other people. And it's really focusing on first this invitation, right? So do we post flyers about Bible study or about something going on at the church at the most unlikely place you might think you would attract someone to come to the Bible study? Do you put them in the library or in the supermarket, wherever there's public boards? Is there something on those public boards that announces the church and what's going on at the parish? You might not get anyone the first 5 times you post those, but when you do have someone, the Lord has sent that person to you. Or even better yet, do you ever think about taking the Bible study off the parish property into the coffee shop? Or having the Bible study in the public library? Or gathering with people where they're gathered, rather than inviting them to come to a place that may not be familiar enough to them that they feel comfortable walking in. And so in some ways, it's taking our very basic ministries out and inviting them to public places. We have found with the sacrament of reconciliation, it's far better to offer it when people are gathered than it is to simply sometimes add more times to the reconciliation times at the parish. So when we have theology on tap for our young adults, which is usually in a local bar somewhere, we always have reconciliation. And it's so funny because for some of them, they just want to go to reconciliation to say they've been to reconciliation in a bar, but the fact is they go, and they come back, and they now look forward to it. Because we've gone there to invite them, to be with them, rather than waiting until they come to us. So it's that kind of rhythm to think about, where can we be when people are there, and to what can we invite them? So I want to end by a few questions that are found for our reflection in living as missionary disciples, particularly in this art of accompaniment. So Francis reminds us that in accompanying others, the disciple, we, the missionary disciples, possess a love for others and the church by being welcoming and hospitable. And so here are some of the questions that are posed. In what ways am I accompanied on my journey of faith? And who accompanies me and my family? How do I accompany others on their journey of faith? Do we plan parish activities with accompaniment in mind? And then, of course, always, what areas can be improved? And so the final thing that I would like to end with is what it is that Jesus asks for us in this commitment to accompaniment. And this is what the bishops have written. We need others to model lives of discipleship and accompany us as we grow in spiritual life and experiences of ongoing conversion. Similarly, as missionary disciples, we are called to love and accept all people in a way that invites each person to a deeper relationship with Christ and a greater alignment of their lives with Jesus' teaching. We are never called to make judgments about others, but Pope Francis also says that we cannot truly know a person from without, but rather we won't know them until we enter into conversation and relationship with them. And so this idea of accompaniment is both this reminder that we're called to go out, but to be ready to meet people and to walk with them. So I'd like you to spend a little time in conversation. Two things. What does it mean for your parish to be involved in the life and the concerns of your local community? And where is one opportunity for accompaniment that either you know your parish has been thinking about but hasn't acted on, but that you yourself know is a good place to start this practice of accompaniment? So maybe in groups of 4, and maybe with someone you haven't chatted with yet, spend some time talking about those 2 things. Okay, Andy's going to come around from the microphone, and I'd love for a couple of people just to share, what does accompaniment look like in the context of your community, in your parish?
Hi, my name is Mabel from St. Peripheries in Tipta, and what I noted was in the grocery store a population of young people from like middle school to the end of high school that not that they don't have a desire to know Christ, not that they don't have a desire to be a good person and to have a purposeful life. It's just that the priority of going to church or celebrating parish life is also among the priorities of having friends, going to school and going to basketball games and all that. So it sometimes gets lost and muddled. So an idea that kind of came to my mind was just like at basketball games where people hold up posters saying, "Good luck, da 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 da, Mom and Dad love you," that we could do the same thing where some of us hold up a poster saying, "Great job, good luck from St. Gregory's. We love you and we support you, and we're always praying for you." You know, something like that where it's not like in their face, but it's like we're not forgetting you and we're supporting you. Mm-hmm. That's just something that came to my mind. And
I love that idea.
Yeah. So here's another idea.
Well, in Southeast, if your kids are involved in any activity in high school, half the time they're not in town. You go to church on Sundays. And I was wondering, and I've kind of thought about this at different times, if we could communicate to all our high school students where the Catholic churches are in the different communities and what the Mass schedule is, and even maybe communicate with the coaches that if it's at all possible we want our kids to go to Mass, then maybe that would help the kids know that we really feel it's important enough to talk about it. I mean, I know that the Diocese sends out to every parish in the summer for the tourists a schedule of Mass times in the different parishes. And I think maybe, you know, that's something we could do for our high schoolers too. Mm-hmm. I had a mom came up and talked to us, and she was so excited because her teenagers who had gone to the swim meet in Petersburg had gone to Mass that weekend. Now, granted, the church is right across the street from the swimming pool, but nonetheless, they still went to Mass.
Yeah, no, it's,
And so, I mean, that's maybe a possibility. It's that we could, the different communities cooperating and making sure that all the kids know where all the churches are. Because I think some of them would go to Mass. I had one student tell me that for a while one of our coaches was Catholic, and she would round up all her Catholic students and take them to Mass. But sometimes their coaches aren't, and they have to be able to step out on their own. or get permission to go. And they have, but if we can make sure that people know that it's important to their families, to their kids, then maybe we can help them.
My sister-in-law volunteered to be the parent who would go on the trips to round up the Catholics to take them to Mass. So she relieved the coach of the duty by saying, I'll do it, I'll find the church that's closest, I'll round the kids up. Much to my niece's horror and embarrassment, but she did it. So yeah, I think working together is a great idea.
Two things.
Okay.
Something that I was talking with too. Many of us go to different masses, and so when we see people in the grocery store who might be in our water aerobics class or something, we don't know they're Catholic because they're at a different mass until we go to a different mass. So that's something to just throw into it. But Beth had something that was really good to say too.
Well, down south, my family's very committed to Saturday nights. They take care of kids and have family experiences. And so one thing here at St. Paul's is, well, what I wish more of is more community, more times. So it'd be neat if we had like Saturday nights, maybe St. Peter's every Saturday night, and I'd be willing to help with this ministry. Just, from 4 to 10 or something, have kids dropped off and families could stay, and just do it every Saturday night. And it just becomes a part of supporting our families. And, I was a mom of 3 with no family in town, so it just brings more people. And then young people would come because then they feel really good about littler people, the littles like the bigs, and then, you just sort of around. Anyway, it's a lot of fun.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. I think we have time for one more. Annie's getting her workout. We've got to take her.
I'd like to add a little humor, but also in truth, because I'm a convert, and I really struck a chord with me when you started talking about bringing people in only at Easter, because virtually that happened to me. I remember the day I decided to be Catholic, and I wanted in now. And I was so excited, and I wanted to be Catholic now. I mean, this was a decade ago, but I remember going in and saying, I'm ready, take me, and being told, you have to wait and take a year's worth of classes first, or something along those lines. And I was stunned, and I thought, well, the Protestants will have me like right now. How come the Catholics don't want me right now? And so I think that I understand that we need to be educated and taught, but there may be a way to support people, a little more along the way, and give them some rah-rah signs like, yes, the Catholics will have you, let's educate you first. My mind was already made up, so, God and I.
Thanks be to God, exactly.
Thank God I was going to be Catholic. So the point is, I thought I would just add some humor, that I had no clue that I had to wait till Easter. Didn't even really understand the reason why, and it wasn't till years later that I figured out the reason why, sort of, and I won't say what I still think it is, but I just want to add some jest. Let's be more welcoming to people, because I love being Catholic. I chose to be Catholic. It's a great day to be Catholic. Let's make sure people don't know that go off to the Protestants because they'll accept you today. And I think that I just want people to know that.
No, I think that's exactly the kind of thing we have to stop and remind ourselves, right? To have the conversation with you first, because you don't know what it means, the RCIA process, or why Easter, exactly to your point. Or even when people call on the phone, right? Are we conscious that it's a moment of encounter? And sometimes we're hurried and we're rushed, and so that's a perfect example of where the conversation would have set a completely different tone. But thank you for hanging in there. Okay. All right. We're going to get, we'll give Father the last word here. That's always a good idea, right?
Holy shit, it'll be good. You really? I'm Father Dwight. I'm from St. Gregory's in Sitka. So I've already got a couple new new suggestions, which are already in my heart. I just want to say, for myself as a priest almost 22 years, I think one of the most important parts for me is to try to get out of the rectory office. I have to do things in the rectory, there's administration, that's part of my duties, my vocation, and being here in the Diocese of Juneau, it's been wonderful with Bishop Andrew. And I have to say, trying to reach out, and I've only been around since July 12th when I landed in Sitka, looking for those opportunities. So I try to go in my clerics to the grocery store. I haven't been able to do it yet. I want to go to the assembly meeting. I want to be present at the high school gatherings. And if, we have Mount Edgecombe High School, we have Sitka High. I missed an opportunity on the plane to say a prayer yesterday, coming to Juneau, Sitka High. But the part is, just to be out there. We have to make our presence known. And I can say some of my greatest ministry moments have been talking to people in the grocery aisle, the vegetables, the meat department, the milk, trying to, get my own stuff. But Father, could I ask you a question? I haven't been to church in a while. Could you talk to me maybe one day about my marriage? Those moments, and you have that opportunity also. So it's a great time when people are there. Be enthusiastic, be there for them, and I think that way we can reach out, and people will eventually maybe take that step into the church to talk with us, to be at Mass, to enliven their faith again. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you.